Good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well and that you are ready for an informative session this morning. As you saw on the pre-training presentation slide, it was just mentioning that there will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and that also this session will be recorded and made available. The videos we have prepared, it has been brought to my attention that we cannot email them, so we will be sharing a link. We've created a Google platform so we can share it via YouTube with you guys. So the links will be shared today for both today's session and for those the session we had for the safety representatives as well. Okay, so just a bit of an overview for today. The whole series that we're planning is to help you make more sense of all the information that we're often sharing with you, the health and safety systems that we're providing you for purposes of implementation, so that you are just more comfortable with the whole process. I know often it feels very overwhelming when you look at all of the documents that is part of this big system. So today is going to be very much of an introduction, and then as we go forward in the series, we will start breaking down elements of the whole system, specifically focusing on the purposes of these documents, why they are there, why they are necessary, and then going through it and seeing what elements can also always be changed or looked at and maybe reviewed. And that is also why your practitioner is part of the session, so that if there are any questions raised by you in particular, they can also then sit with you afterwards, going through these aspects, trying to help the system suit you and fit you better in the end. So welcome and thank you for being here. We are not a very big group today, which is, I hope, going to give us a lot more opportunity for interaction. You will notice that currently you cannot change your settings in terms of your microphone and that you are currently still muted. Should you have a question and you raise your hand, we will unmute you or we will give you access to speak, and then you will be able to interact with us. Okay, thank you, Tamika, for that message. Okay, so I'm just quickly going to put the invite up in front of us again so that you can see the next dates and how this will work and affect your planning as well. So you'll see that there are 3 more sessions this year. So we have one Wednesday, the 31st of August, 28 September, and then 26 October. And then we will go into the next year where we will have 2 sessions running, one for new people who have not yet had the opportunity of getting through the introduction. And then for those of you who are already part of the process that we've started this year. Today's session will not be the full time slot because it's more of an introduction, but the next sessions, based on your questions that also gets raised during each of these sessions, the session will get a little bit more bigger and contain a lot more information. So please, if you have any particular questions that you would like to be answered during a session and you get to notice it as we go through a month, please don't hesitate to inform your practitioner about it, and your practitioner can then also let me know, and we can make sure that we address those elements that you specifically struggle with in your implementation process. So please never hesitate to ask us any questions to make this more specific to your needs and your requirements to simplify the whole aspect of health and safety. Okay, so I'm going to put another diagram up in front of you guys. This is a bit of an overview of just understanding that everything in terms of health and safety is integrated. There is a governance, the Health and Safety Act, that stipulates exactly what needs to happen. It says that there are requirements in terms of legislation that needs to be adhered to. Companies need to do certain things. Employees need to do certain things. We touched on the employee responsibility during our safety rep training 2 weeks ago. And then there are regulations that also come into play. And these regulations also help us determining what exactly is necessary for us to comply with legislation. So if we start with the legislation, we will see that there are certain responsibilities that we need to comply with, and this starts at the very, very top. So you can see that at the very top, the CEOs have responsibilities, the owners of the company, and they need to make sure that the whole structure in terms of health and safety is implemented and maintained in a company. They then have the right to delegate these responsibilities, because we all know that the CEO doesn't just have one job. In terms of legislation, there's quite a lot of legislation they need to adhere to. So they often delegate aspects of their work so that every element of legislation is covered. And if we talk about legislation that the owners need to comply with, it's not just health and safety. We look at the Environmental Act, we have the Skills Development Act, Employment Equity, Labor Relations, Companies Act, Corporate Governance. The list goes on. There's really an exhaustive amount of legislation business owners have to comply with. So in each of those legislation, the owner or the CEO has the right to delegate these responsibilities so that they can then be compliant with legislation. So the primary delegation is then to the assistant of the CEO, the 16.2, and that is a person then that has as much responsibility almost as the CEO. And that's why it's very important that you cannot just appoint any person in this capacity as a 16.2. And if you do take on that responsibility and liability, that you are then familiar with the requirements that you are exposing yourself to. So in that aspect, we always encourage, and we are now, I will briefly touch on that closer to the end, but we encourage any person within a responsibility position within health and safety to attend legal liability training. And legal liability just touch on the legal aspects where you in a certain capacity become responsible for whatever happens. Okay. Then in addition to the assistancy of the CEO, we have additional appointments, and these are just a few appointments, but as you guys know, each industry, each business has a different set of appointments. So we have our incident investigator, our first aider, our safety representatives, our safety committees. You have your firefighters, your evacuation wardens. Then we have risk assessors. We have in the construction industry working at heights, manufacturing, you have a supervisor for machinery. You'll have a ladder inspector, a hand tool inspector, a housekeeping inspector, and there's quite a lot of appointments when you start looking at the different regulations. Let me just drag this because the mouse and I'm not friends today. So part of the health and safety structure then is also the health and safety system. Currently, it still speaks of a policy or a plan within the Health and Safety Act, but based on the amendments that they are planning on implementing as of next year, they will be referring to a full health and safety management system. And this system has different elements, and these elements includes your policies, your procedures, your organizational structure, responsibilities, how the people are affected and incorporated into your system, how they fit into it. All of those elements affects then your system as a whole. And your system starts with your policy, your commitment as a company, and then out of that policy, there is a whole lot of information that needs to be covered, where we then look at your risk assessments, your procedure in terms of how do you plan on implementing health and safety in your working environment. those clients who have the environmental aspects as well, that's also included into this. So it's a very comprehensive approach to health and safety, and we then need to make sure that all of those little elements are addressed and implemented within a business. Okay. So we have spoken 2 weeks ago about the general duties of an employee, just making sure that employees understand that they have a responsibility towards health and safety. It's not just the responsibility of the employer, but to quickly touch on the duties of the employer. One of the primary things is that employer must establish a safe and healthy working environment, that they must monitor the risks that are that might be in the workplace and communicate and inform employees regarding it, and ensure that they maintain the working space. So if we're talking about the working space, it's the condition of the building, like carpets and roof tiles and the kitchen, water supply. It's your tools like a grinder or bench grinder. It can be a laser cutter. It can be a drill press. It can be absolutely anything that your employees need to use to perform their jobs. We even speak about laptops and computer screens and those things where it affects the health of the person, and therefore you need to make sure that what the person is working with is in a good condition. So from this, you will find that often we appoint a safety supervisor in terms of Section 8 as the supervisor for health and safety, and that person will then assist the 16.2 within the general working space. You will also find a supervisor within construction. And that is very important to understand that there are differences between your appointments for the construction industry and for every other industry. Every other industry's appointments will be applicable to construction, but not all construction appointments will be applicable to every other industry. Okay. Then the functions of the health and safety representative. This is just how they get involved in the process, and this is an aspect that we will go into more detail as we go through the safety representative training. We have a next session during next month for the safety representatives that will be focusing more on PPE because of the questions that were raised during our previous safety rep training. But it's important that your safety reps are incorporated in your safety management systems implementation specifically. When you have a good safety rep, it actually simplifies the implementation of your health and safety system in the workplace, especially if the safety representative has a good relationship with the employees and with management. They simplify the entire process and makes it just so much easier to get the buy-in from the employees in the end. As there are two struggles we often face as the people responsible for implementing the system. You have to get the boss on your side and you need to get the employees on your side. And then working with a safety rep hand in hand actually has quite a few benefits. Okay. Then we spoke about the risk assessment that needs to be implemented within a workplace. The risk assessments there to identify any possible hazards that might be in your workplace, whether it is tripping over a cable or falling off a ladder or falling through a roof or in a motor vehicle accident or falling off your chair. It doesn't really matter. All of those possible hazards needs to be identified, and that then is put into a risk assessment. And we then establish what are the possible risks and what is the possibility of those risks occurring. And for this to be an accurate and effective document and practice, we need the buy-in also then again from the company and also from the people doing the actual work. So when we do pre-task risk assessments or pre-risk assessments during our initial phase with the client, the incorporation and the involvement of the rest of the team is quite important, because this then makes sure that the hazard and risk assessment is very specific to your workplace. in one company, the possibility of falling off a chair will be higher than in another company. In one company, cutting off your finger is much higher than in another company, where one place you're working with knives, busy with food, and in another place you are just busy with papers. And it's very important for us to establish the differences. And that's then again why we need to work so closely with you as the client, and then with between yourself and the practitioner. Then there are different risk controls where we are looking into your PPE, your safe working practices, engineering controls, administrative controls, whether it's possible to eliminate the risk completely, and what type of risks are considered as a no-go risk. If that is the type of risk we're going to experience in this company, then we need to make changes so that it's not there at all. One of these no-goes is that despite all your controls, if someone were to get injured in this specific activity, they will still pass away. Then we need to review that entire activity. And that's sometimes where we then need to get together and see, okay, these are our high risks, they are too severe, the outcome of it is too significant, the impact of that outcome will be detrimental to both the person's life and to the company. So what can we do to help one another in finding ways of working better and safer? And then monitoring and review. And this is something we really want to put a little bit more focus on. And that's also the purpose of all this training that we're busy with, is to help guide you as a company to get to a point where we can actually come in and do an assessment and say, here is your certificate. In terms of that day's assessment, that audit, you are compliant with legislation, which then means that you can use that document for applying for loans, tenders. You can use it to submit to your insurance company to encourage reduced premiums. There's quite a lot of advantages when you get to a point where we can say, but you as a company are compliant with the legislation, and therefore you are a lower risk company to the different aspects of business. Okay. Emergency planning, that's one of the other things. One of the areas we're also focusing on a little bit more with our clients as of August is that we want to get more fire drills done, or not just fire drills, emergency drills done. So you'll find that as of August, your practitioner will be communicating more often in terms of getting arrangements made to ensure that your emergency evacuation procedure is properly communicated and implemented, so that you can conduct a fire drill or an emergency evacuation of any sort within your business. And then at least that is one of the records that you can keep then on your file. This has to happen at least once a year to show that you are prepared for possible emergencies within your workplace. Incident management, this is then just focusing more on the injury on duties, seeing that if there is any IODs, what can we do as a company to reduce these injuries? What can be implemented? Is it training that needs to be taken and to be done? Is it maybe PPE? Is the person too short for the working space or too tall for the working space? There are so many elements that can possibly result in people getting injured, and those are then things that need to be reviewed and monitored. And should there then be an IOD, we really want to encourage you as a client to let us know, so that we can see whether it is an IOD that needs more training, more awareness, or is it an IOD where we need to help you find a solution that can reduce any IODs? Because IODs in the end has also significant impact on the business, as it affects your operational abilities. It affects your premiums with workmen's compensation and Rand Mutual. So all of those things in the end impacts your business. So if we can reduce these negative aspects of poor health and safety, then your business will start experiencing the value of having these practices and principles in place. Okay. And then we spoke about training. One of the most important aspects of the Health and Safety Act is that it puts a lot of emphasis on communication, on informing people about the risks that they might be exposed to, about the safe working practices, the rules of the company in terms of health and safety, providing them training so that they can ensure that they do their work safely. There are certain work that the criteria is that it must be accredited training. For example, if you're working at heights, you must go and be trained by an accredited service provider. But then other training, like training on your safe working practices, that's something we can do in-house. There are ways of including the induction process where it's more comprehensive, or breaking it down into different elements. And then finally, we get to the regulations, and the regulations occasionally changes. They get amended, they are made more, depending on what the Department of Labor see as a need to help and encourage clients or companies to be compliant with legislation. And these different regulations then also speaks to the musts a client must do. So in terms of your general administrative regulations, it will say that there must be an incident investigator. There must be a safety committee if there are more than 2 safety representatives in the workplace. That a company will have safety committee meetings in the event of there being a committee, what has to happen in terms of that. Your general safety regulation speaks of what must happen in terms of a first aider. What's the criteria there? There must be a competent person. They must be trained in terms of the accredited training requirements. You will, if you're working with ladders, you must ensure that the ladder is numbered, that the ladder is in a good working condition, and there's someone to inspect the ladder. So wherever you find something within the regulation that you are affected by, that regulation then becomes applicable to your working environment. We find that the construction regulation, even though it makes mention to construction, is often applicable to all our clients, because the moment you are working on a ladder, you are working at heights, and therefore the construction regulation comes into play. The moment there is a hazard or a risk in a workplace, the Safety Act speaks of a risk assessor, but the next place where we then find a risk assessor that has more specific elements of what needs to happen for a risk assessment, we then refer to the construction regulations again. So often we might think that it's not really something we do, but just because it's not part of your business operations for you to make money does not mean always the regulation is not applicable. One regulation we do, however, know is not currently applicable for any of our clients is the diving regulation. One of my teammates once read it as the driving regulation. It was a bit funny because it took her a while to realize it's got nothing to do with machinery or vehicles, but it was a good read, she said, in the end. But yeah, we also then have noise-induced hearing loss. So if you're working in a space where there's a lot of noise, a lot of humming, electrical buzzing, those are things then we need to look at as how it will affect your business, and make sure that the correct regulation and aspects and sections of these regulations are implemented within your working space. So that is just the whole system in a very compact nutshell to explain how health and safety in the end is integrated within the different aspects of business. I don't know if there's any specific questions at the moment. Before I continue, let me just quickly go back to my Teams screen. Yeah, I see there is someone typing at the moment. Okay. Does the 16.2 appointee sign the staff appointment letters or the 16.1? Okay, so depending on the size of the company, some companies will not have a 16.2, and then the 16.1 will be responsible for signing the staff appointments. But the 16.2 can sign any of the staff appointments in the end, because the responsibilities of appointing personnel has been delegated to the 16.2. So yes, the 16.2, it's one of the reasons there is a 16.2, so that we can get appointments signed without having to hunt down the CEO, as that person is running around in certain places, occasionally like a headless chicken. Leon is still typing. Okay, what's the difference between a supervisor for the office and a construction supervisor? Okay, the supervisor for an office has to implement health and safety in terms of the Health and Safety Act, Section 8, where the Section 8 then specifies that the supervisor needs to make sure that people work safely, that all risks have been identified, and that the machinery and equipment is in place. A supervisor in construction has similar responsibilities, but their focus is just on the area of a construction site. So you might find within a construction environment that you have 9 or 10 supervisors responsible for different areas, and their primary focus is on construction safety. So they're not going to focus on the rest of the premises or the rest of the company's responsibility to health and safety. The construction supervisor will be focusing on his or her area in terms of health and safety, but also in terms of operations. So your construction supervisor is also responsible for the operational requirements, while your safety supervisor's primary focus is on the health and safety that the people are exposed to. Does that clarify that, Leon? Okay. So I'm just quickly going back to the PowerPoint. Just need to click on the correct button here. Okay. So in terms of implementing your safety system, it's very important to start at one area. Don't try and do everything at once, because the moment you try and communicate and implement safety system all at once, it gets overwhelming. You lose track of the things that needs to happen, and then when you do sit in an audit or an inspection or an assessment, you feel you realize that there were elements that you missed. So our advice is on communication first. So I'm just going to put down the notes for you guys here. If I can find the correct block. Sorry. Okay. So your first start will be in communication. And if we talk about communication, we speak about your policy and your induction. Okay. So your first focus will be on ensuring that your health and safety policy is communicated to your entire company, and that proof of this communication records are either kept on a file or online. And then a copy of your policy must be displayed somewhere in your office. Some companies display their policy in the reception area. Other companies will have the policy displayed in your canteen or on a notice board, but it's very important that your policy is displayed. Okay. The policy must be signed by the 16-1, so your CEO or the owner of the company must sign the policy, and when there's revisions made, that document is then changed, re-signed and recommunicated. So these are your first steps. So we first communicate your policy, and the next element that we then do is the induction. And the induction then speaks of the general application of health and safety in the workplace, which will make more reference to legislation. And then as we go through the process, we will start focusing on safe work procedures, where that is then a separate communication and a separate training. Once we're done with the communication section of the first step, we then go into your appointments, okay? And part of your appointments is also your training. So your appointments are then the signing of the acknowledgement by the 16-1, the appointment of the 16-2, the appointment of your first aiders if you have more than 10 employees in your workplace, appointment of your safety rep if there's more than 20 people, your site supervisor or your safety supervisor in the office space, your housekeeping, hygiene, stacking and storaging, ladder inspector, maintenance inspector, vehicle inspector, and the list goes on. So every appointment that might have been identified, it doesn't mean that once you've signed these appointments that it's done and it's cast in concrete. There can always be changes. Firstly, people change. They go to different companies, or if you've appointed a woman in a position, she might go on to maternity leave, people get sick, people retire. So all of that will affect your appointments. Business operations change. So once you've made appointments, don't see the appointment as the first and the last. If we realize that we need more appointments, we then add those appointments to the system. So these appointments that we do in the beginning is not the only appointments. So please don't think that it has to be perfect the first time around. The one great thing about health and safety is that it is an improvement system. The focus of health and safety is to be continuously improving on what has been implemented, because in the end, you never know what the perfect system will be until you have started to implement it. So that's the one part. And then after appointments, we then start focusing on training specifically to your appointments. So this will be legal liability, first aid, firefighting, evacuation warden, working at heights. If you have a person operating a forklift, so there will be forklift training. Someone who is working with ladders and they need to make sure that they understand how to inspect a ladder. Not all of the training for the appointments have to be accredited. A lot of it can be done in-house. So if we are training inspectors on how to inspect a workplace for housekeeping, how to inspect stacking and storaging, how to inspect your chemicals, how to inspect a fire extinguisher. There's a lot of those inspection appointments that we can do without formal accredited training. It is training that by working through the safe work procedure, you should be able to understand how to inspect a ladder or how to inspect stacking and storaging setups in your warehouse or in your storage facilities, etc. So that is the first part of what we need to focus on. And then we get into your primary procedures. And if we speak about your primary procedures, this is your health and safety plan, your risk management procedure, your emergency evacuation procedure, incident investigation procedure. If you are working at heights, it will be your fall protection procedure. If you're working with scaffold, it will be your design and dismantle procedure. So there are a lot of procedures that is management procedures. So let's just make that a note there for you and say that after your training, we then go into your management procedures so that the employees understand what is the company saying about how we're managing health and safety in the workplace. Okay, again, once these documents have been developed, it doesn't mean it's the end of it. If you realize that the elements of these procedures that I've communicated and implemented isn't applicable anymore, we change it. Something that's very important is that if there's any changes in your business operation, the documents in terms of health and safety also have to be amended. Because should something go wrong on an aspect of your business, let's just quickly make sure. One of your procedures were that we, or an element of your business was we move printers around in the office space. And now we don't do it anymore. We get someone outside the company to come and move it. Then we remove that aspect from the system because we don't want employees to move the printers around anymore. Now, if an employee does go and move the printer around and there's injury or damage, and we then look back at your procedures, the procedures must be able to support your claim against the employee, which is you were not supposed to move the printer. But if the procedure still speaks about the fact that employees are supposed to move the printers, then we start having a conflict, which is then questioned in the event where this might be a severe case and it's been escalated to a court of law where a justice or a judge needs to decide whether it was negligence or whether it was part of the management system. So the moment elements of your business change, it's very important to make sure that you then communicate that to your practitioner so that the practitioner can update your system accordingly so that you are at all times protected against any claim and also your employees are protected against any injury on duty that might be sustained. Okay. Once we're done with the procedures, we go into the risk assessment. And after the risk assessment, the safe work procedures. Now, the reason I'm putting these two up at the same time is because your risk assessment and your safe work procedures often work hand in hand. You've identified risks that need to be safely practiced, and therefore there's a safe work procedure. So if your risk assessment says that it's a high risk working with a laptop, then there needs to be a safe work procedure to say, how do you work safely with your laptop? So it's very easy to do the two together and break your risk assessment into sections. And maybe you want to rather focus on the safe work procedure communication and then include the risk assessment into that, or vice versa, or you can do them separately. So it's not that you must do them together. It depends on what time you have available. It's also worth noting that a lot of your safe work procedures can be integrated. So when we speak about certain portable electrical equipment, like your drilling machines, grinders, hacksaws, your impact drills, those type of portable electrical equipment, you can communicate all them as a single set of communications because they have similar safe work practices. There might be one or two things that's different, but the overall safe work practices are similar in terms of your portable electrical equipment. So you can group those together to make it more simplified or easier for you to communicate the group of safe work procedures to your employees. The same might go for housekeeping, stacking and storage, and safe office work that might be grouped together, or even hygiene can be included into your housekeeping practices. So if you want to know what safe work procedures you can group together, you can then speak with your practitioner and they can guide you into how you can group your safe work procedures and risk assessments to simplify your communication of your system. Okay, and then once we have done our safe work procedures, the next thing is that we need to start implementing these. And part of our safe work procedures is that we need to check aspects of the equipment and working space that we are trying to be safe about. So these checklists might include monthly checklists, weekly checklists, daily checklists. It all depends on what is being inspected and what the regulations say about that particular element that needs to be inspected. Okay. So part of our checklist is keeping our registers up to date, and the registers are then a list of everything that needs to be inspected. So you'll have a fire extinguisher register. The fire extinguisher register will refer to the, all the fire extinguishers in your workplace, and there need to be a checklist for each of those fire extinguishers. Determining that that specific fire extinguisher is still safe for use. I'm just quickly going back to Teams. I see someone have made a, oh, someone's in the lobby. Leon, if you can just let them in, please. Okay. And then we need to monitor all of this. Important about monitoring is that if we implement something to make sure it's effective, we need to review and see whether this is working. If it's not working, we need to make amendments. In terms of our international standards, a very simple way of approaching health and safety is the plan, do, check, act. Now, planning will include creating and compiling the documents, doing will be implementing the system, and then we have checking, which is the monitoring of all of these elements, and then acting, meaning that if there are elements shown during our monitoring process, that we then review and change it as necessary. And then once we've determined that the entire system has been implemented and is functioning, then we can do an audit. And I know when it comes to audit, people get very uncomfortable. And the purpose of an audit is, when we do the audits internally, the purpose of the audit is not to say, oh, you missed this, or you're wrong on this, or this is not right, or you're in trouble now. The purpose of the audit is to help you monitor your process from an external point of view so that you can see where there are areas of shortfalls. Maybe you've missed an appointment, or you've done your appointments, but someone that you've appointed hasn't been trained yet. Or everything is great and we can give you a certificate stating that you're compliant with the legal requirements. So in the end, the point of the audit is to guide you as the client and us as the service provider in making sure that every aspect of legal compliance is adhered to, and you are then protected as a company against any claims. And as I've mentioned, you can then also use your legal compliance certificate in terms of tender applications, applying for loans. It's becoming a big thing with the banks that if you want a corporate loan, you need to provide proof that you're compliant with legislation. And that same certificate can also be provided to your insurance company, where you can then negotiate better premiums, because having health and safety in place should reduce your risk as a company in terms of possible damages, loss of equipment, loss of material, recalls on production, redoing work because there were mistakes or someone was absent or equipment was malfunctioning, claims, third-party claims, all those things should be reduced because your health and safety system addresses such a big aspect of your working environment. So we will go into more detail on these elements as we go through the next three sessions, or next three sessions, sorry, are August, September, and October, where we will go into more detail in these elements on your safety system. And we are even going to go into more detail and more depth on these aspects on why they are important as we go into the next year sessions as well. Any questions with regards to this? Are you guys comfortable with the references to appointments within your current company? Are you comfortable with the appointments that you have to make for your staff? Is there any issues that you're having when you're appointing employees? Those are often aspects that we need to consider, is that we have identified someone to appoint, but they don't want to sign the appointment. What do we do then? Tamika. Not all appointment letters have to have an end date. It's an option for the company to decide whether they want a person to be appointed for a specific period. Appointments that do have end dates are appointments which is training expires. So your safety rep will have an end date because they have to be retrained. First aid will have an end date. Your firefighter might have an end date. And your project-specific appointments might have end dates, but it's not a requirement that all appointments have an end date. If you don't want an end date, you can always remove it. Or if you feel that you want to appoint this person just for a fixed period of time, then you can include an end date. So an end date on certain appointment letters are optional. Other appointments, like I've mentioned, your safety reps, first aiders, fire